Hello, my name is Rebecca Friedlander, and I'm thrilled to be with you today as we talk about the topic rescue. Do not underestimate the importance of crying out to God. Before we dive into this, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm an author, speaker, and filmmaker with a master's in Celtic studies, and my recent films include Celtic Pilgrimage and Thin Places, both the movie and the TV series. And I also teach an online class on Celtic studies for the Evangelical Episcopal Theological Seminary. You can learn all about this on my website, RebeccaFriedlander.com. And so as we tap into this topic of crying out to God in prayer, I know of no better way to illustrate this than going back into history and pulling some stories of the early Celtic saints who walked the land and lived this lifestyle of prayer. And they got to see the results, the beautiful, fruitful place of passionate prayer and crying out to God. So the movement of the early Celtic saints, now we're talking about the year from 400 to about 665 AD. That was the golden era of the Celtic saint movement. Really was inspired from another movement that came from the desert fathers and mothers of Africa, of the Middle East, of places that were a little bit closer to the birthplace of Christianity. And what began to happen from about 200, the 3rd century on, was this mass exodus of people who left the major cities because they desired to get close to God in nature, in the desolate wilderness. Sometimes they would leave their distractions, they would leave their worldly possessions, and they would go and they would seek God in the place of prayer. And this was such a huge movement that it was even said that soon the cities would have, or the deserts would have more people than the cities, because there were so many people going to seek God in the wilderness. And they lived a lifestyle of prayer. And so what we see happen in first with St. Patrick and later with Columba and Hilda and Aidan and some of these heroes of the Celtic way is that they actually picked up and learned from this movement of the desert fathers and mothers, moved that forward and added their own creativity to their lifestyle of prayer. I love how Andy Rain, who's a friend of mine and author on Holy Island, Lindisfarne, says it like this. The early Celtic saints would teach people how to live their prayers and pray their lives. And this whole Renaissance movement that swept Christianity into some of these very pagan lands of the British Isles, as they were at that time, was actually a lifestyle and a movement where prayer and real authentic prayer was at its core. And so we have stories of people who would write prayers for the everyday man, that people who were milking their cow in the morning, and as they milked their cow, they would say a prayer to bless their cow. As they were putting on their clothes in the morning, they would be putting on Christ, and they would have a prayer for that. And in a day and age where people were illiterate, they couldn't just pick up a Bible, and neither were the scriptures accessible like they are today. They could learn how to pray, and they could build a lifestyle of fervent prayer. And I love the stories like of Caedmon, who was England's first recorded poet, who had an experience with an angel who encouraged him to sing. And he couldn't sing a note. He was a terrible singer until he had this encounter with the angel who said, "Caedmon, sing me a song." And he opened up his mouth, and this beautiful song about God and creation came forth. And it said that he wrote hundreds and hundreds of songs from that point on that everybody in the community could learn to sing. And in that way they could sing their prayers to God, and they could sing their praise to God. The Celtic saints always had a love for the 150 Psalms of Scripture as well, and they wove that into their prayers on a regular basis. They called them the 350s, since there were 150 prayers, and they would divide them into groups of 3. In some of the communities, it was even required that people memorize all 150 Psalms, and then they would go and recite them on a regular basis. So we have stories of Columba, who would go out and walk and begin to say the 350s as part of his worship to God. And he would have read verses like he would have recited verses like Psalm 62:8, which says, "Trust in the Lord at all times. You people, pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." He would have recited scriptures such as Psalm 34:17, which says, "The righteous cry out and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles." And Psalm 18:6, he would have said, "In my distress I called upon the Lord, and I cried out to my God. He heard my voice from his temple, and my cry came before him, even to his ears." The Celtic Saints took this idea so literally of crying out to God and of how he was a refuge for them, that they even likened their communities to the Old Testament cities of refuge in Scripture. We can actually go to Glendalough in the Republic of Ireland and see the ruins of an old Celtic village or Celtic monastic community. And just before you enter in, or as you're entering in through the gate, there is an ancient stone there with the shape of a Celtic cross carved into the stone. It's very primitive, it's very rugged, and they called it the sanctuary stone. And it was said that anybody who traveled by, whether they were an outlaw or someone in a lot of trouble, or just did not have a home, or they were a stranger who needed a place to stay, all they would have to do is come to Glendalough and touch the sanctuary stone as they entered and identify with the way of the cross. And by doing so, they were stepping into the place of refuge. And it was this idea, again, of calling out to God, of pouring out your heart before him, of being authentic and real and identifying with the cross and with the way of Christ, and then stepping into the refuge that God provides. I also love the story of Saint Aidan on the island of Lindisfarne in probably the 6th or 7th century. We're not told exactly what moment of history that it occurred in, but it was while he was cultivating his community on Lindisfarne, and he was actually keeping some of the tradition from the desert fathers and mothers. They had what they called in Egypt the outer desert and the inner desert. And the inner desert was the place of community with the other saints. It was a literal physical place where they would have their way of life and community together. But then for places of solitude and prayer, they would go to the outer desert. And those were places that were uninhabited. Aidan was at Lindisfarne, this beautiful little island off the coast of Northumbria in northern England. He had established his outer desert community, and then he decided he was going to leave that community on Lindisfarne and step out to pray on one of the outer islands. And at one moment he looks up and he sees across the waters to the mainland the castle that was owned by the king of that region. The king was a good friend of Aidan's. And there was an enemy army led by King Penda taking piles of brush and wood and leaning them up against the castle in order to smoke out the inhabitants within. And as Aidan is watching all of this, he's too far away to help or to call out for help. So he falls on his knees as he sees the king and the nation that he loves being under attack, and he begins to cry out. And this is the prayer that he prayed. He just said, "Oh Lord, see what evil Penda is doing." And at that moment, the wind shifted and changed, and we're told that it blew the smoke away from the castle, saving the inhabitants inside. And it's this beautiful picture of how prayer and crying out to God makes a difference. How God honors those who come by way of the cross through Christ to the Father and begin to make their petitions known in prayer. And he is such a good Father that he listens and he hears our hearts when we cry out to him in prayer. So as we close, I just want to encourage you that no matter what is going on that you're concerned about, whether it's something in your nation or something in your family or something in your own life, Take time to cry out to God in prayer, knowing that He is a refuge for us, and His own word tells us that He listens to those who cry out to Him. And especially when you come through Christ by the way of the cross, you have open access to the love of the Father, who loves to answer the prayers of His children. Thank you, and God bless.